Hi. Semi-modular synths are becoming so popular that it may seem like if your synth doesn't have a patch bay, you're missing out on something. And there is something to it. There are so many interesting sequencers like Rene 2 or Ornament and Crime here, or interesting sound generators like Plats and Rings, and many other modules. And on the flip side, you may want to enhance your eurorack setup with interesting control surfaces like Medusa here, or the FM synth inside Digitone, or any other synth really. Now, there's a violent way to add a patch bay to your synth, especially if it's analog. You can take it to your local mod maker and have him or her drill holes in it and patch into analog touch points, but if your synth is digital, and even if it's analog, you might want to stay away from that. Luckily, there's another way. So for example, in this setup, I have Rene and Ornament and Crime sequencing different tracks on the Digitone. So here, for example, Rene is patched into MIDI channel 3 into the Digitone and is playing this bass line. Every step here is translated to a note here. And if I bring up track 1 and bring down track 3, then Ornament and Crime here is generating a random sequence on the Digitone's track 1. On the flip side, I'm routing Medusa's grid into Plats with modulation on the y-axis, and the audio is going back into Digitone into the reverb here. I've also got a second channel going into Rings. And these are all brought down from Eurorack level into the Digitone. Now, while sequencing this gear from here and playing notes here and having them play back here and then audio routed back here may seem trivial, and it certainly isn't rocket science, it does require an understanding of audio levels and how notes and modulation information is sent over CV and MIDI, and how MIDI and control voltage and timing work. By the way, semi-modular synths also let you rewire their components to each other internally in different ways, depending on what the manufacturer decided to include in the patch bay, and that's nice, but a little bit more self-explanatory in modular synths, and has been going on with regular synths too for quite some time, in the form of switches, knobs, faders, or a mod matrix, depending on which features the manufacturer decided to include as modulation sources and destinations. In this video, I'll look at what I think is the more exciting part of semi-modular synths, which is interconnectivity with other modular gear. Now, unfortunately, there is no one product that can just slap on a patch bay onto one of these synths. So in this video, I'll break down the various components of MIDI and CV and discuss various modules that can together behave as the ultimate patch bay for regular synths. Now, in order to make this work, we need to understand how Eurorack modules exchange different types of musical information, as opposed to how regular synths do it via MIDI. Generally speaking, Eurorack modules, whether they're analog or digital, speak analog control voltage using a TS or tip sleeve type of cable. Audio, note data, triggers, clock, and modulation all pass through these cables, and that's how modules speak with each other. Now, the information a Eurorack module or a semi-modular synth sends or receives is typically clearly labeled next to the jacks. So if you want to connect one module to the other, you typically clearly see what an input is, what an output is, and which of them does what. Regular synths communicate differently. Audio output is typically analog as well, but at different levels, much lower than Eurorack. And note and clock information are sent and received digitally via MIDI. Many regular or non-modular synths are capable of receiving and sometimes sending modulation information over MIDI, but typically how they do it isn't clearly labeled on the device itself, but rather left to an appendix at the end of user manuals, and just like your own appendix, seems like a pain you want to avoid. So say, for example, if you wanted to change the timbre on a module like Plats, you just vary the voltage going into here into the timbre jack. If you want to change the timbre on a MIDI-based synth using a different synth, you need to open up the manual, find the CC message that's relevant to the particular parameter that you want to change, and like I said, a bit of a pain, but it's worth the effort to understand it. Anyway, let's look at bridging these two worlds, one piece or type of data at a time. Let's start with audio, which is the easy part. In Eurorack, audio levels are high or hot, meaning that they oscillate from -5 to +5 volts or 8 volts or even 10 volts. Now, regular equipment taking that kind of input will at best distort and at worst be damaged by those levels. So if you want to send audio from Eurorack to regular audio gear, you need to attenuate it. And if you want it to go the other way around, you need to amplify it. For attenuation, in the setup that I have here, I can either use a regular mixer, as long as it has a level control, or a module like SBG from ALM, which is designed to interface from and to Eurorack gear and regular gear. The Digitone, for example, aside from being an FM synth, has a fantastic effect engine with reverb, delay, and chorus, which you can apply to audio input coming into it. So as long as you attenuate your Eurorack audio, you can, for example, add chorus to it, using this as an external effect engine. So attenuation going this way is pretty easy. However, if you want to take audio and bring it up to Eurorack levels, you need to amplify it. Now, a regular Eurorack VCA might not do the trick, though some have amplification. Here too, SBG has an amp just for this purpose and can amplify much more than a regular VCA. So that was audio. Let's move on to notes. Now, unlike analog audio, which is sort of similar in Eurorack and regular synths, note information is very different in MIDI versus Eurorack. MIDI is digital, whereas CV note information is analog. With MIDI, notes are sent in two separate MIDI messages. One activates the note at a certain pitch and velocity, and the second one is sent later on when it's time to turn the note off. You can send as many notes as you want on a single MIDI cable, and they can be sent in any one of 16 different channels, again on one single cable. Eurorack or CV voltage-controlled notes are very different. A single cable can only contain the pitch of one note at a time. The typical standard is 1 volt per octave, and the one cable can't also contain velocity, on-off, or any other information except maybe pitch bend, I'll give it that. Note on and off information needs to be sent in another cable, and that's sent either as a high voltage level that needs to be held for the duration of a note, which is called a gate, or if you're triggering a note or percussion, then a short voltage peak trigger will do as well. If you want to send velocity information, you need to do that in another cable, and same goes for additional modulation information. So all this for just one note, you can see why MIDI is very popular, especially for polyphonic information. One more little bit of basic theory: if you want to send modulation information that isn't sent alongside the note on or off because it's ongoing information, that is typically sent via MIDI CC or control change messages, though there are some special messages like pitch bend, aftertouch, or pressure and program changes. Clock or timing or tempo is also different in CV compared to MIDI. We'll talk about that as well. So let's start looking at how we bridge this to this and back. The first thing you'll want to check in terms of setup, other than your synth having a MIDI in and out port, is that MIDI is enabled. Now that's typically in a menu somewhere here on the Digitone. There's a MIDI config menu with a few options. Same goes here. You've got to go into the MIDI menu and make sure that all the MIDI in and out features are turned on. We'll talk about clock, transport, CC, and note information. I won't explain how to do it on these synths because obviously it may be different in yours. Just make sure that it's active, otherwise communication won't work. Okay, so with that said, sending MIDI to CV requires a module that will take MIDI's individual parts and split them into their CV counterparts. There are a few different types of ports that can receive MIDI depending on the MIDI to CV module that you're using. There's 5-pin MIDI DIN, USB, and some modules like Bitbox use this small 1/8" jack for MIDI. If you want to get really fancy, a module like Aither can receive digital data wirelessly and convert it either to MIDI or to CV. Once the MIDI connection is made, and here I'm using USB into PolyEnd's Poly, a MIDI to CV module will let you split up MIDI information to various CV counterparts. So Poly here is simple and comprehensive. It lets you take up to 8 different notes and split them up into 4 counterparts: pitch, gate, velocity, and modulation. It's a comprehensive module. It also supports MPE, but it may be overkill if you just want to send 1 or 2 notes. Other MIDI to CV options are Disting over here, as long as you have its MIDI expansion. Disting, along with its expander, will only let you send one note at a time, but it has 80 other module functions, so you might want to consider this if one note at a time is enough for you. Hermod, which is also a sequencer, lets you configure how you want its outputs assigned. You can have 8 note and gate pairs, or you can configure Hermod to output velocity and modulation like Poly, but you'll start using up more outputs and won't be able to send out as many notes. There are a few other manufacturers that make MIDI to CV modules not shown here. There's Yarns from Mutable Instruments, Mutant Brain from Hexverter, Expert Sleepers also makes FH2, and there are a bunch of others. A good MIDI to CV module will also convert MIDI pitch bend information as modulation to the note information sent to the pitch output, so watch for that if that's important for you. Aside from note information, you might want to send modulation information from your controller over to Eurorack. A good use case for that is the mod wheel on MIDI controller, or in the case of Medusa here. Every single pad sends out modulation information as you roll your finger up and down the pad, so just be aware of modulation, not just pitch or gate, as something that you might want to send to Eurorack. Now, aside from mod wheel, aftertouch, and pitch bend, some MIDI to CV modules will let you assign any CC channel to voltage as well. Now, there are at least 2 cases where that might be useful. First, most digitally controlled synths, even if their core engine is analog like this one, also send CC information as you move the sliders and knobs. This information can be sent, say, to a module like Aither here, and then converted to control voltage to control anything in your Eurorack setup. Furthermore, while it's rare, some instruments like the Digitone and Digitact have a built-in MIDI LFO, which means that it can generate CC modulation in various interesting LFO shapes that can also be synced to its tempo. Now, this can be converted to CV and applied to Eurorack modules. So if you don't have a Eurorack LFO, or you don't have one that's capable of being synced to a tempo, this might be a nice solution. Okay, so we talked about bridging MIDI to CV, so you can get your MIDI controllers and synths to talk to Eurorack. What about going from CV to MIDI, so that we can apply some of the interesting sequencing and modulation options of Eurorack to our plain old hardware synths? Here too, there are a few ways to go about it. The first is by using a CV to MIDI module. Now, here it's a little bit easier to recommend specific modules because I'm not familiar with a lot of modules that do CV to MIDI. If you know of others, please leave a comment below, but the ones that I have here are either Disting, Aither, and General CV. Disting can convert CV gate and pitch into a MIDI note and either send velocity or convert CV to CC using one of these outputs. And again, you will need to attach this expansion module to it. Aither can convert 4 different voltages to 4 configurable CC channel values, and I believe they're going to add the ability to convert a pair of inputs into one MIDI note. And the king of the CV to MIDI hill is General CV. It has 9 CV inputs that you can configure either as 9 separate CC channel outputs or up to 4 CV gate pairs to send notes via MIDI or any combination thereof. So in this setup, I have X and Y configured as separate gate inputs and inputs 4 and 5 assigned as CV inputs. X and 4 send MIDI notes on channel 1 to Digitone, and Y and 5 do the same thing for channel 3 on the Digitone. And all this is fully configurable on this slightly tiny screen, but you can work with it. Each of these modules isn't just a one-trick CV to MIDI pony. There are other things they can do that are beyond the scope of this video. In general, Disting is a multi-purpose module with about 80 other functions. Aither will also let you send and receive modulation information wirelessly, and General CV also has a built-in polyphonic digital synth and drum machine. So CV to MIDI is one way of getting Eurorack data into your regular synth. If your synth has an expression pedal input, another trick to converting CV to CC messages without using modules such as these is to use a floating ring cable connected to an attenuator that can limit and ensure positive voltage output matched to what the voltage of your expression pedal input is expecting. Now, I've already shown how to do that with Maths or with SBG by ALM, and there's a link to that clip below or to my tips and tricks ebook on Patreon, which contains more information about that. Let's move to the last piece in the puzzle for bridging between Eurorack and the synths world, and that is clock. If you want to have more than one sequencer running at the same time across modular and regular synths, you're probably going to want to keep their clocks in sync. Now, clock really means two things. Though some synths bundle them together, it's transport, which controls starting or stopping your sequencer, and tempo, which is how fast it runs. Technically, for transport, MIDI has simple start, stop, and continue transport messages, and in the modular world, it depends on your module. Some modules don't have any transport functions, others may accept start, stop, or reset trigger messages, and others may run the transport based on gate or high voltage messages. For tempo sync, MIDI works on a 24 ppqn basis, or 24 pulses per quarter note. So for example, if a sequencer on the receiving end wants to move one quarter note forward, it will count 24 MIDI pulses and then play the next note. In modular, some modules will just move a step forward every time they receive a trigger, and others will accept different ppqn settings, so you can have them run as a multiple or division of the original tempo. And don't forget, your synth needs to be open for transport either in or out and clock in or out for all this to work. Once that's set up, there are quite a few modules that know how to either receive or send MIDI clock and transport and convert from one to the other. For example, Pamela's new workout can either generate its own clock or sync to other modular clocks and send out both MIDI clock and MIDI transport. Pam also supports DIN sync out, which uses the same DIN cables as MIDI but works differently, more like analog modular synths actually than digital MIDI. To move transport and clock from MIDI to modular, you can use a module like Hermod or Disting with its expander module, which can do both. I'm sure there are plenty of other modules that can handle that as well. As per all the cases I mentioned, please write your favorite module in the comment section and why you think it's best. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully your non-semi-modular synth doesn't have to be jealous of semi-modulars anymore. If you like this style of content, there's plenty more of it in my constantly updated book of electronic music tips, tricks, and ideas available to supporters of this channel on Patreon. If you have any questions or insights on bridging MIDI and CV, please add them in the comment section below. Hit like if you learned something and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.